Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Doug Padgett here on the 21st of January. I'm in Minneapolis, where it is negative 11. Rob Ryersey is somewhere outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas. Rob, what's the weather like there in Arkansas?
It is a chilly 11 here in Arkansas, which, you know, for as cold as negative 11 sounds in Minneapolis, 11 in Arkansas is, it's chilly.
I hear you. And we have the Doctor of Economy and Economics for the Common Good Podcast, Fadhel Kaboub. Dr. Kaboub, where are you, and what's the temperature like, in your great part of the world?
Well, hi. Thanks for having me back on the show. I'm here reporting to you from Granville, Ohio, central Ohio, and the weather is cold, 18 degrees.
18 degrees. We need more degrees in the world, like we need more money in the economy. All right, Fadhel, we're gonna get into this. Every other week we talk about monetary theory and modern monetary theory, and how many of us have been told a story of how the economy works, that all the money belongs to the people, and then we give it to the government, and then they spend it in ways differently than we would want to spend it, and we all get frustrated about there not being enough money. And then some good news, folks like you come around and say, oh, no, that's not actually how it goes. The way it goes is the Federal Reserve produces money, and then we spend it, and then taxes take it out of the economy, and then Federal Reserve puts it back in different places and in different amounts. And there's a whole money going in and money coming out of the economy, but it's actually driven from the government side, and then we become the users of that money. Do I have that sort of right in these last?
Yeah.
Generally
it's
get at it?
MMT, or modern monetary theory, as you said, is simply reminding us that the U.S. federal government is the sovereign issuer of the currency, the U.S. dollar that we use. As such, it doesn't operate like you and I, a household or a private business, where we have to earn the income first in order to spend, and we spend within that limit, or we have to borrow and go in debt, and then we really have to work hard to earn more income or cut our spending in order to pay that debt. The federal government doesn't operate under those principles. It has a much larger spending capacity than what we're told. And that spending capacity is not infinite. It's not unlimited. It's constrained by the risk of inflation, which is, the hot topic of the day these days. And MMTers, we're literally obsessed with the risk of inflation, because that's the real constraint. So as such, we have a very different explanation for what really causes inflation and what really constrains how much spending the federal government can afford. And also, we've developed ideas about how we can actually tame the actual inflation pressure points. And as you'll see from the conversation today, it has nothing to do with the Fed raising interest rates. It has nothing to do with the government reducing its spending on, helping the poor and the homeless and hungry children. As a matter of fact, it's going to get really interesting when we get into the conversation. But that's kind of the starting point.
And it is, and it's super helpful right now.
The inflation debate.
Yeah, because this is the big debate driving so much.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it's so important for people that are first learning about MMT and modern monetary theory, that there is like this tremendous shift in your brain that you need to understand. We have had drilled into us, our whole lives, this idea that the federal government, Washington, D.C., works like a regular American family, where you're sitting around the kitchen table with your calculator and, your bills laid out, and you're, trying to manage your family budget with a limited amount of money and the expenses that you have with your bills. And you're trying to figure out, do we have enough? How do we make more? If we don't, where do we cut? All of this stuff. And then we get these metaphors that spending is like, using a credit card. Listen, the basis of modern monetary theory is that this analogy that this story that has framed how we think of the economy is completely wrong. It's just not the way it works. Now, it is the way it works for a family. It is the way it works for maybe a city or a state. but it's not the way it works for the federal government. And I just think it's so important for people to just kind of put out of their mind that like that analogy, that story, and say, okay, I've got to be open to a new way of thinking. Fadhel, are you suggesting that modern monetary theory says basically like the federal government has the proverbial money tree? Like they say, like money doesn't grow on trees, and are you suggesting that, I don't know, maybe it does?
Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard Stephanie Kelton sometimes say money doesn't grow on rich people, right? As opposed to money doesn't grow on trees, because there's this dominant narrative that says the federal government is like the rest of us, right? You need to earn the income in order to spend it, and we say money doesn't grow on trees, meaning you either have to tax somebody to generate revenues for the federal government to spend, or you have to borrow from somebody. You tax rich people, you borrow from rich people to spend. And as such, once you start borrowing and you promise to pay back plus interest, you have this burdensome debt that you have to pay back. How do you pay it back eventually? By spending less and by taxing, generating more revenues at some point in the future. So you're always trapped in that framework. So that is true for states and municipalities, and all of us know this at the local level. When your local school district needs to build a new gym or a new school building, we pass a tax levy, and all of us, the residents, pay for it, right? Interest and principal and all that. So we're familiar with that. At the state level, your state, most states have a balanced budget mandate, and when they borrow, they have a tax plan for generating the tax revenues to pay for that stadium or the infrastructure or whatever it is. So that is true for cities, municipalities, states, but the federal government is under a different setting because it's the sovereign issuer of the dollar. It literally creates it into existence.
Yeah.
And that usually blows people's minds. What do you mean? You just print it? Literally, yes. Otherwise, where would the dollar come from?
Yeah.
Does that mean we
Yeah.
should go crazy with the money printing in irresponsible ways? Absolutely not. It's just a statement of fact that Congress, the 535 people we sent to Washington, D.C., they have the power of the purse. They have the legal responsibility to spend responsibly. And here, responsibly means different things to different people.
Mhm.
Responsibly, fiscal responsibility usually means, in the mainstream sense of the term, you only spend you live within your means, tax or borrow in order to spend and pay your bills on time. Here, in the MMT sense of the term, they have the legal capacity to spend in ways beyond the tax revenues and so on. So the responsible thing to do is to spend in the most neglected areas of the economy, is to spend to build resilience in the economy, to strengthen the economy, not to collectively shoot ourselves in the foot by not building infrastructure, by not educating our population, by not investing in strategic areas that will strengthen the economy and strengthen this democracy. That, to me, is irresponsible, but it's done in the name of fiscal responsibility. So we can't afford to invest in kids. We can't afford. But then we afford to build the prisons and pay for the drugs epidemic and pay for the pollution, health consequences, and all of that. To me,
And the
that's
war machine.
irresponsible,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's the irresponsible behavior of neglect and abuse.
Yeah.
So this is-
if
this notion-
is saying we do have the money to pay for these things. We just have to have a responsible strategy that prioritizes where the spending goes to get the most bang for the buck, so to speak. And it's not constrained by deficits or so-called national debt and things like that.
And this understanding that the federal government is not restrained by not having enough money. If it's going to be restrained, it's going to be restrained by the economic system's health. Sometimes I wonder if politicians understand this. In Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, she does a nice job of saying, when the House under Nancy Pelosi says we're going to only buy things that we pay for, the pay as you go, it confuses people. They start to, and when Barack Obama says, we're living beyond our means and these kinds of things, it's not just conservatives and it's not just progressives or Democrats or Republicans or independents. It's all kinds of people. You kind of wonder if they get it. And then we get to the real situation this last year when we start talking about inflation. And then here comes Joe Manchin making an argument that to spend another $2 trillion on top of the COVID spending, on top of the infrastructure bill, to put more money in the next 5 or 10 years into the economy is just going to be too much spending and cause inflation. And at that moment, I thought, maybe Joe Manchin actually understands how the federal government works and is having a disagreement about when we've put too much money into the economy. Is that a fair way to describe the situation that we're in currently?
No, and I'll tell you why. So Joe Manchin and
just love it. No,
good,
just leave it at that, Fadhel. That's good.
the
That's good.
Senator Joe Manchin, and sometimes referred to as King Joe Manchin.
That's right.
Senator Joe Manchin and others who use the inflation narrative to argue that we've spent too much and this is going to cause inflation, they often refer to something like they say, well, we've seen this before. We've lived through something like this, the inflation of the 70s. And what was the dominant narrative about the inflation of the 70s? I'll tell you the dominant narrative, and then I'll tell you actually what happened and what caused the inflation of the 70s. And I'll tell you actually how we ended up, ending the inflation of the 70s. And you'll see the gap between the reality and the dominant narrative. So the inflation of the 70s, we're told, was due to too much government spending. Unions were strong. Consumers had a lot of income. The welfare state was spending in the 60s. And a lot of conservative economists and politicians were yelling and screaming left and right in the 50s and 60s that this is too much spending, welfare, deficits, all of that, on top of the Cold War spending. And I said, eventually this is going to break the economy. It's going to bankrupt us. It's going to cause inflation. And what happened? The 70s, we did have inflation, very high levels of inflation. And the dominant narrative that rose in the 70s and really became concrete in 1980, when Reagan and Thatcher took over the two most powerful nations in the world, the dominant narrative that was built out of the 70s inflation was this was caused by too much spending, too much welfare spending, government spending. So what we need to do to end the inflation of the 70s is two things. One is get the government out of the picture. So start to privatize and reduce government spending. And two, we're going to hand the keys for inflation management to the central bank, to the Fed. And what does the Fed do? It's going to raise interest rate. This is what Volcker did. Raise interest rates in order to fight inflation. So that was the narrative. And Volcker told us, I'm going to break the back of inflation, right? So that's the dominant narrative. And the success, quote unquote, success of that is, with us to this day. They tell us that this is how we fought inflation, is by getting government out of the picture and raising interest rates and doing the right thing, the responsible thing. Now, what's wrong with that narrative? A whole bunch of things. Number one, what caused inflation had nothing to do with labor unions or too much consumer spending or welfare spending. I'll tell you what caused inflation. Number two, what ended the cycle of inflation had nothing to do with reducing government deficits. Remember the Reagan deficits? They didn't go down, they went up, and had nothing to do with the Fed raising interest rates and claiming victory over inflation. So what actually happened is the following. The root cause of the inflation of the 70s was a conflict in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis. Had nothing to do with consumers or labor or deficit in the US. Completely independent phenomena. Conflict in the Middle East led to tension between Arabs and Israelis. The Arab countries decided, you know what? We control a huge chunk of the global supply of oil. We can use this as a bargaining chip, as an economic weapon, so to speak, to apply pressure on the West, on the US and Western Europe, to, reduce their, tilted approach to the conflict and supporting the Israelis in that conflict. And so what happened? The Arab states, the OPEC countries, reduced their production of oil, artificially reduced the production. The demand for oil was still the same. So when there's so much demand for oil and not enough
Yeah.
production, the price goes through the roof, right? So the price of oil goes through the roof. What happens next? Everything that uses petrochemicals in it, and it's everything around us, everything around you, around your desk, the hair product, the textiles, the paint, the carpet, the shipping, heating, cooling, everything is oil based, especially in the 70s. So the price of everything, energy, transportation, petrochemicals, all of that went through the roof, which means the price of every product you buy as a result went up. And that's inflation. Had nothing to do with consumers in the US or deficits or labor unions having strong bargaining power in the US economy or in Europe. But the narrative was hijacked. Say, aha, we told you all that welfare spending and irresponsible spending is going to cause inflation. So that's what caused inflation. How did we end inflation in the US and around the world? Two things. The first step in taming that inflation related to energy prices was Jimmy Carter deregulating the natural gas industry, trying to find a substitute for imported oil, at least for energy production, electricity and heating and cooling. And that started the fracking frenzy that we live the consequences of
Right.
here. That was a side effect. Jimmy Carter put a solar panel on the White House, on the roof of the White House,
Right.
which Reagan took down, by the way, eventually. So we were moving in the right direction in terms of finding a substitute so we don't have to import the expensive stuff from the Middle East. So that was one way of dealing with inflation. But ultimately, what really killed the 1970s inflation was actually signing a peace accord in the Middle East and ending the conflict. Oil prices went back down and inflation was gone. It had nothing to do with the Fed raising interest rates. It had nothing to do with going after labor unions or throwing consumers under the bus with the mass unemployment of the 70s that was created. Because if the source of inflation is a conflict in the Middle East that drives oil prices, now tell me, how does raising interest rates in the US going to solve the conflict in the Middle East and reduce oil prices? It doesn't. It simply increases the cost of doing business and excludes more people from the economy. How does reducing government spending on infrastructure or health or education and going after the deficit and consumer spending in the US is going to solve the source of inflation, which is a conflict in the Middle East? Of course, it doesn't. The only thing it
Yeah.
does is starve people to death and throw them under the bus, right? And that's what the misery of the 70s was self-inflicted, right? So
Now, Fadl,
here's
as we,
here's where let me close with this,
Yeah.
yeah,
because the hijacking of that narrative and building a whole philosophical framework about what causes inflation, how we dealt with inflation, and how we move forward is with us to this day, because hijacking that narrative is being used right now by people who are
Yeah. Right.
saying we know what causes inflation. What are they saying about inflation? Too much government spending, big deficit, lots of money, um, the subsidies we give to hungry children, the COVID relief that we give to Americans, that's what's causing inflation. So, what we need to do is exactly the same they said we did in the 80s: reduce the spending on welfare and benefits to the most vulnerable, and hand the keys to the Federal Reserve Bank to raise interest rates and throw the rest of us under the bus. And the Fed already said they've committed to raising interest rates 3 times this year, at least. So we're about to live the same tragedy
yeah,
because of that false narrative. And if we lose this debate today, they're going to use this narrative for the next several decades
Gotcha.
to say what caused the inflation of the COVID years was too much government spending on relief, on helping the poor, on feeding the children, on building infrastructure during a time where we shouldn't be building infrastructure to fight climate change and all that. So they're going to use it against us to reduce public spending on the basic necessities that we need to build a thriving economy. And
yeah,
that's why we can't afford to lose this debate
Yeah. It's
and let them
important. Yeah.
hijack the
yeah.
narrative again.
So in the 70s, the answer to the question of what was causing inflation was this conflict between Arab nations and Israel. and
Yeah.
causing OPEC to raise oil prices, which then, I mean, no pun intended, trickled down to, the cost of everything going up as a result of that.
Right.
Do you have a clear sense of what's causing the inflation that we're now experiencing?
Thank you for the question. That's where I was going next. So, if you've heard me speak now, you probably are wondering, like Rob, what is actually causing inflation if it's not too much government spending on the poor, on the vulnerable, on the COVID relief? What's causing inflation is a couple of things. One is a pre-existing inflation pressure points that we've had in the US economy pre-COVID. That's number one, and I'm going to explain those. Number two, with the COVID crisis, we've had additional inflation pressure points that are strictly related to the COVID disruptions, related to supply chains and other things. And this is where I'm laying out the MMT explanation of inflation. So let's talk pre-COVID, and let's see those inflation pressure points, how they accelerated, and then add the COVID pressure points. And then from that, you'll see where the solutions to inflation ought to be. And they're very counterintuitive based on the dominant narrative. So pre-COVID, we had 4 areas of key inflation pressure points in the US. And I think all your viewers will know what these are because we pay for them. We see the bills and we live the consequences. One is healthcare. 2 is energy and transportation. 3 is real estate. And 4 is education, right? So when you look at each one of these subcomponents of inflation pressure points, you realize that the sources of inflation risk have to do with 2 elements. One is the lack of productive capacity in those industries. That is, we create exclusive services, and as a result, they're more expensive. And 2, it has to do with the abusive market power that key players in the economy have, whereby they can restrict the supply of productive capacity, create artificial scarcity, and raise prices simply because they can, or because we let them, because they're not regulated. So what MMT suggests is, number one, we need to invest in increasing productive capacity in those areas. So they're not exclusive and scarce anymore. And when you do that, you're actually going to spend more to build capacity, not spend less.
Mhm.
Number 2, you're going to use your antitrust laws. You're going to tax and regulate that abusive market power out of existence. You're going to go after cartels and price setters and price gougers in those industries in order to democratize and make that market more competitive. Now, that's where it gets political.
Mhm.
Who's
Yep.
supposed to do that? It's the 535 lawmakers who are supposed to do that. Now, what are we about to do in the US right now? Number one, we're not going after price setters. We're not enforcing antitrust and updating our antitrust laws. We're not taxing and regulating their abusive market power. Number 2, we're about to reduce spending in key areas of the economy that will give us additional productive capacity. So we're doing exactly the opposite. Number 2, what else we're doing? We're going to raise interest rates. The Fed is going to raise interest rates. Now, tell me, how does raising interest rate is going to reduce the market power of big pharma? Nothing.
It's not.
How is raising interest rate going to go after slumlords and real estate companies that speculate in real estate? Nothing.
It's not.
Right? If
Yeah.
anything, it may actually fuel these things. How
Mhm.
does raising interest rate going to help us build more resilient energy and transportation system? Nothing. If anything, is going to fuel it. So we're about to do the opposite of what needs to be done. And this is pre-COVID. So now the COVID disruption added another layer of challenges, which is a global supply chain that's been disrupted because of shutdowns around the world. Now, when you have a wave of COVID in China, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Mexico, and you have shutdowns, and then you have disruptions in shipping. And because we've built uh, in the last few decades this just-in-time supply chain,
Mhm.
right? Lean and mean, just-in-time supply chain where you cut costs and cut corners everywhere. Now we're realizing we actually need just-in-case supply chains. And companies are moving very rapidly to just in case. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a producer here in the US. You're producing beef or chicken for distribution in supermarkets and so on. And all of a sudden, you have all these COVID disruptions, and you realize, well, you can produce the meat, you can produce all of this, you can cut it, prepare it, and now you need the styrofoam trays. And where are those coming from? They're coming from China or from some other producer around the planet. And you have shortages, right? Because they had shutdowns and there's no shipping, and the shipping is more expensive. So now, as you muddle through to make things work, you realize this just-in-time supply chain is really not working for me right now. So what I need to do is order 5 times the amount of styrofoam I need just in case, right? There's more disruption over the next 5 months. Now, everybody's doing the same for styrofoam, for all kinds of supplies, just in case. Now, the global economy was not built to serve 5 times the globe for styrofoam, for all kinds of materials. So this creates, obviously, massive shortage of productive capacity, because the demand now, this panic that we're having collectively, is only due to the disruption and the fact that we know we don't have COVID under control. We're going to keep getting new variants. We're going to keep getting new disruptions. So I'd better order 3 or 5 times what I need just in case.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
That's
the
point
toilet
number one.
paper. It's the toilet paper situation all over
The
again,
toilet
but on a
paper
global
effect
scale.
across the whole system. Exactly. Another key thing to the disruption of supply chain that feeds now into the abusive market power is the fact, because we've built this narrative about the COVID inflation, cost of doing business is going up, so that justifies raising prices. The key players that have abusive price setting behavior, they're laughing all the way to the bank with this, because they're using it as an opportunity to increase prices beyond the cost of doing business. And this is not me saying it. All you have to do is just listen to the CEOs on those corporate shareholder phone calls, where they're saying the pricing environment is favorable to us. Meaning, and look at their reports. The profit margins are higher, record profits during the pandemic, simply because they can, because we let them. For example, shipping a container from China to the US, West Coast, pre-pandemic, roughly $2,000 a piece. Now it's going for $20,000, $25,000 a piece, simply because they can. Now, does all of that additional cost, is it warranted? Absolutely not. Is some of it trickling down to workers in the logistics and shipping and trucking industry? Absolutely not, right? So who's going to fix this? The Fed raising interest rates is going to fix the logistics infrastructure problem? No. How are we going to fix it? Invest more in more resilient logistics infrastructure, tax and regulate the abusive price gouging that's happening in key industries, and then we'll tame the source of inflation. Are we about to do this? Not really. We're about to spend less. We're definitely not touching corporate power. And we're doing the exact opposite. We're raising interest rates, hoping that it will produce some magical effect of reducing inflation. So that's why it's so important to understand where these dominant narratives come from, and to understand the real sources of inflation, so we can go after inflation. We all want to reduce inflation, but
all
we're
right.
aiming.
So Fadhel, here's a question I have for, and tell me if I've got this right. One argument is too much money in the system causes inflation. The other argument is not enough available product in the system causes inflation. You're saying in 1970s and currently, the lack of available product is what's driving inflation, not that there's too much money. And then we say we let them raise the prices of things because there's not enough of the product, so they're going to make it more valuable, a classic sort of, demand and supply argument. But isn't one of the arguments that the reason people can pay more is because we've infused so much money into the economy? That's one question. The second is, you've been saying, oh, look, MMT is worried about inflation. We think it's possible to put too much money in the economy. Has that ever happened, though? Because the two examples that we have of inflation were not driven by too much money being in the economy. So if $4 trillion, $6 trillion of current spending and promised spending in the last 24 months is not the reason that inflation has happened, then is there really an amount that's too much we could put in the economy? Because it's been interesting. You've been arguing that, we have to worry about inflation. MMT is obsessed about this, but that's actually never been the cause for our inflation. So can you help me put those two pieces together?
Very good question. I love how technical you're getting with your analysis.
I am indeed, my friend. Yeah, I mean,
this is good. This is good, and that's what it takes really to challenge a lot of these narratives. So, on the question of do we have too much money in the economy? In a way, yeah, but not in the right places. So when we have people unemployed and displaced because of the COVID pandemic, when we have so much neglect over the last several decades, and now the government stepped in with a little bit of relief for low-income families, we blame that part of the economy, saying you have too much money. You have plenty of money to eat and feed yourself and take care of your children. That's way too much. We can't afford that. It's inflationary. But we have no problem with having too much money, fueling speculative behavior in real estate and financial markets and driving inequality. That too much money is okay. That's not inflationary. But it's just a little bit of cash we gave to low-income families to feed their kids and keep them safe during the pandemic. That's way too much. Right?
Yeah, we've got a billionaire
really a matter
space. We've got a billionaire space race, but a family getting $500 a month to get groceries for their kids. That's the problem.
But then the narrative tells you that those billionaires, that's their money. They've earned it right way, right? And what we're saying is that they've earned it through abusive price-setting behavior, anti-competitive behavior. That's where antitrust laws need to be upgraded and updated to make sure that those markets are competitive. Because here's what textbook economics tells you, under a free market competitive system, which is what many people claim we have, when you have an industry that's profitable, that's attractive and thriving, a new competitor will come in and say, hey, I can compete with these guys. I can take some of their market share. I can innovate, and I can, undercut their price by a little bit and benefit everybody else, benefit consumers and so on. But when entry into the market is effectively impossible for the little guy, even for the medium-sized guy, that market is not competitive. And that's where anti-competitive practices need to be investigated, because that's how we drive down cost and improve customer service and delivery to consumers, and everybody benefits. That's what we're talking about here.
Okay, so I do not want to ever be
on a global scale, Doug, if I
go
may.
ahead, yeah. Sorry, I've got a delay.
Five companies. There's a sound delay a little bit.
Yeah, there's a sound delay. Sorry about that.
There's 5 companies, global mega corporations, that control the majority of the global food supply system. 5 companies. That's not competitive. This is what we call cartels.
Yeah.
Right? They're illegal when it's drugs, but it's okay when it's pharmaceuticals and when it's food and when it's energy. And we pay the price for this.
Right. And one of them is called Cargill. Actually, the cartel. And okay. I don't want to be a Joe Manchin apologist at all. I think he's wrong-headed on all this. But I hear him saying, look, in light of the current inequalities in our system, that more money goes to the rich than to the average person, that's how it's all tilted. You're saying, okay, if there's too much money in the economy, it's not because there's too much, it's because it's too concentrated in certain places. Then he says, if we're going to put all this new spending in, whether that's through infrastructure or through other soft infrastructure pieces, we have to means test it, their language, so that we're sure that the money doesn't go to the people that our system wants to put the money to, which is the people that already have it and the wealthy and the ones who don't need it. So a lot of the argument that's currently going on inside of the Senate is around means testing who should get the child tax credit, who should receive the cash payments. Is there something in there that you would say, yeah, that might not be the solution, him being nitpicky about which family gets child tax credit isn't the place, but that is the right approach, that when we spend money, we have to decide to not do what the Republicans did in 2017 and do a tax break to the most wealthy because it doesn't move through the rest of the system. But we do need to means test this. In the real case scenario, not the theoretical scenario about, who produces the money and who's the spender of the money, but where we find ourselves now in light of our economy, do we have to be more targeted with our current federal spending to get to the outcomes we want? Because it feels like these big bills didn't really do that. They kind of came in with a tsunami approach of just overwhelm the system with money and we'll figure out where it goes later. And I hear some people saying, hey, we have to be more precise about it. Is there anything in there that actually is a starting point for people to, get ourselves moving forward here?
So the bill that would have had the more structured way of undoing some of the structural deficiencies that we have in the U.S. economy, that would have targeted real estate, housing, energy, transportation, pharmaceuticals and healthcare, higher education, the actual inflation pressure points.
Mm-hmm.
There's a name for this proposal. What is it, Rob? I think it's called the Green New Deal.
The Green New Deal? Yeah.
Yeah. Which was designed by, the MMT approach to the Green New Deal was really to build an anti-inflation, transformative economic system. So by anti-inflation, meaning the two things that I described: increasing the productive capacity in those areas and making them more affordable and inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, taxing and regulating the abusive market power of the key players in those industries, right? That would have been, means tested in my sense of the term. In other words, making them accessible, creating millions of jobs, and killing the sources of inflation that we had in the U.S. economy pre this. So doing a Joe Manchin means-tested type of spending is not going to address any of those structural things. It's like taking the engine of inflation in the U.S. economy and feeding it either 100 billion or 300 billion. You're still feeding it. You're still feeding that market power. You're still feeding the inflation pressure points. You're not challenging. You're not changing the engine. You're just saying, instead of giving families $100 each per week, we're going to give them 25 instead, and we're going to follow through and make sure that they don't take that money and go buy drugs, like he said in one of his statements. Yeah. As if people who are addicted to opioids or any substance are waiting for a government check to find, drugs. Yeah. Or I mean, it's nonsense. These are much deeper issues that have nothing to do with government checks and things like that. But if we really wanted to avoid a scenario where people have to use food money to buy particular substances, then we should have created the rigorous infrastructure, the education, the skills, the jobs, so they don't have to fall into a system of abuse and neglect and all of that. That's the structural solution.
Got it. So when I hear people, Republicans especially, say things like, hey, what this Green New Deal wanted to do was to fundamentally restructure the economy, right? That's the critique. You're saying, yeah, that's exactly what it should do, because that's what we need to do, because that's how we can deal with issues of inflation. And other Democrats said, no, we're not doing that. We're just going to spend a little more. That feels like that real question right there, a fundamental shift in the nature of our economy. That feels like what this economic argument is about, really. It doesn't feel like it's about a little bit of money here, soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure. It doesn't feel like 5 years or 10 years. It feels like these are really, this is not about how much money or where it goes, but how do we want our economy to be structured?
Exactly. And Rob, you probably remember the first time you heard me talk about the Green New Deal, I said my biggest fear is for this narrative about the need for all of this infrastructure spending is going to be hijacked by some politicians who know nothing about the consequences of what they're about to do, and then spend without actually transforming the economy, feed the existing engines of inflation, and then inflation will actually materialize. When you feed it, it's going to give
Yeah.
you inflation.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, we spend too much, we have inflation, so now we need to reduce the spending.
Yeah.
Whereas our proposal was actually to spend more, but in a strategic way, and to tax and regulate the inflation pressure points so that we can
Mm.
prosper without having inflation, and actually transform the engine from an engine that produces inflation, produces exclusion, produces pollution, into an engine that produces equity, prosperity, decarbonizes the system, and creates all the benefits that, without causing inflation. And unfortunately, COVID hit, and we just fed that engine a little bit more, and now we live the consequences of feeding an engine of inflation more money to produce inflation, and now blame it on the poor and throw them under the bus so that we don't challenge the powers to be who actually drive the sources of inflation.
So if the outcome is not going to be a fundamental restructuring of our economy in the next 48 months, what should the guiding principles be in the next 48 months for decisions that Congress and the presidential administration are going to make around spending? Granting, we need a fundamental restructuring because this is built on shaky sand and it's unfair and unjust. But if we can't get there right now, and a bill has to get passed or not get passed, and this new version of Build Back Better is going to be broken up into little pieces and try to come at it in how would MMT, or how should we all be thinking about how to support or call for the spending of new monies or the removal of old money out of the system? How should we do it if we can't get to the more desirable, larger structural shift?
Very good question. So first of all, I want to make sure that we understand that what I'm about to say is really not a political statement, because this is not to benefit the Democrats' agenda or the Republican agenda. This is the people's livelihood we're talking about here in terms of inflation and jobs and cost of living and all of that. So what we need to be doing...
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, there's a little bit of echo. What we need to be doing is spending more, not less, in the strategic areas that I described. That has to do with energy, transportation, healthcare, democratizing access to those things, and taxing and regulating the abusive price setters in the system. And that's just to deal with the pre-existing sources of inflation. And that requires more spending, not less spending, and that requires a much more effective way of using the democratic system we have, which is the lawmakers doing their job, which is to have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not for the CEOs and CFOs and the elite 1% who control those industries. If that's what we want, to have a functioning democracy. That's number one. Number two, addressing the inflation pressure points related to COVID is much more challenging than what I'm going to describe here very briefly. Some of those inflation pressure points we can manage here in the US internally. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's really putting a dent in the pandemic itself on a global scale is what's going to eventually do this. So at the local level in the US, unclogging the logistics supply chain on our end of the world, which is ports and trucking and transportation. And that has to do not just with building more logistical capabilities at the ports to unload quickly, but also dealing with regulation of how the industry is done. For example, truckers in the US have been Uberized. They work as Uber drivers. No salaries, no benefits. It's kind of, you're a contractor, a subcontractor, so you get paid by the load. So if you drive to the port and you have to wait for hours, right? 8 hours, in some cases 10 hours for your load, you're really not making money on that load because you still have to drive. And we regulate how long you can drive legally, safely on the road. So that's where the 80,000 missing truck drivers that everybody's talking about come from. They quit.
I see.
Because it doesn't make sense for them to lose money in the business. So you have to regulate the way we employ and pay and regulate the transportation system. We need to build infrastructure so that we make it much more efficient by building more rail to accelerate the unclogging of the supply chain, lower cost, make it more competitive, and so on. That's what we can do on our end. But on a global scale, if we allow the COVID pandemic to continue to thrive in different pockets of the world because of no vaccinations, no access to resources to slow down the spread, and as a result, slow down the possibility of more and more variants coming in and disrupting the entire world, then we're constantly going to have disruptions. We're constantly going to have shortages, and that source of inflation will continue to happen. So we have to take this seriously, and this is where my pessimism comes in on the pandemic side. We're not even close to doing that on a global scale, especially in the global south, which means there's probably going to be, at least until the end of this decade, dealing with COVID, God forbid, dealing with much more dangerous variants that will create more disruptions, and as a result, more shortages, more delays, and feeds abusive market power, and as a result, feeds inflation. And nobody benefits from this.
So we keep hearing people say, you can't hire good employees. It's really hard to find employees. And restaurants, that I go into have signs up that say, we're doing the best we can. My local UPS store said, "Hey, please be nice to us. We're doing the best we can, or
Right.
come work for us if you really want things to be better." The argument has been, well, that's because over the last 2 years, people had a bunch of money transferred into their bank accounts. They don't need to work right now. They're either living off the savings of that or something else, and that is what's caused this lack of employment or these missing jobs. But then prices of things are on the rise. Some things, anyway, are on the rise. But then the stock market is doing better than ever. These three factors seem like that's a mix-up that doesn't seem like it normally makes sense, right? In the old world, you would have a different combination of those things. You wouldn't have unemployment or jobs sitting empty, inflation, and the stock market doing well. Is this because we've worked up an economy that's very novel, a global economy that's novel, and actually all of our explanations for how the economy work might not be very accurate because we're in such a novel economic moment in human history?
A very good question. And you're absolutely right. These things don't add up, right? Things should be operating differently if there was really a shortage of labor and so on. But here's where, again, false narratives dominate. MIT just produced a report on this. The Sloan Business School there produced it. And what they found about the shortage of labor, which is concentrated in the lowest paid, most miserable working conditions segment of the labor market in the US economy, that the reason why workers are not interested in those jobs is because the employment conditions are miserable. And the pay, even though it's rising slightly, doesn't really make up for it. And add the pandemic disruptions to their own health, the health of their family, childcare, all of these things, long overdue issues, are now at least emboldening working people to demand a little bit better in terms of working conditions and benefits and so on. Especially that those same companies that we're talking about, who are, claiming they're really struggling to find workers, they're reporting record profits, right? As we speak.
Yeah.
So something doesn't add up there.
That's
so what
right.
you need to do is redistribute a little bit of your profits from shareholders and top executives to your workers. Give them benefits. That's how you attract workers who are committed to the job and are willing to take the job. Offer much more decent working conditions, and you'll have the right workers. So that's where the struggle is now with this great resignation. The other thing is about this false narrative. When you look at the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the numbers that you often see reported, are the numbers of job openings, and it's compared to the number of people who are officially unemployed. And it's showing that there is a gap, right? We have labor shortage. But what the BLS also reports that the media frequently doesn't share with you on the main headlines is that there is another large category, millions, 6.3 million to be precise, as of last month, of people who are not counted as officially unemployed,
Yeah.
people who would be willing to take a job if one was offered to them. They're not included. So if you include what you and I would call unemployed, that large number of the official plus the unofficial, we actually don't have a labor shortage. But what we have a system of abusive neglect, where people who are excluded from the labor market and are coded as unemployable, undesirable, people who apply and apply and apply and never get called back, they're typically women, minorities, people with disabilities, returning citizens, people with lower experience and skills and education and so on. They're coded as unemployable, right?
Hmm.
Long-term unemployed become coded unemployable. So when you start digging into what's causing that long-term unemployment, what's causing that neglect that we collectively impose on millions of people in this country, it has to do with lack of resources and availability of resources. The fact that the jobs don't pay enough for people to be able to actually afford transportation. The job doesn't pay enough for people to afford childcare so that they can have somebody taking care of their kids or elderly family members who need care also at home. So when you provide universal services that include
Mm-hmm.
healthcare, childcare, elderly care, you'll bring millions of people into the system. Last time I checked, there was 3 million people, mostly in the Midwest, who are not in the labor force, even though they have skills and experience and they have the desire to work if there's employment. They're not working because there's no public transportation and they can't afford reliable transportation. That's why they're out of the labor force. So when we talk about universal services that will upgrade our transportation system, uh, afford affordable childcare, elderly care, healthcare, millions of people will re-enter the economy. And when we
Hmm.
pay them decent wages, they become even more productive, more committed to those jobs, and everybody benefits. So this myth of workers not existing in the system is not true. There are millions of people who want to work. The jobs don't pay enough. The employment conditions are miserable enough. And there's so much neglect that they have to deal with at home that we're not
So
dealing with and not willing to deal with.
yeah, that all rings true to me. But what changed, 20 months ago? Because all those conditions were in place,
Yep.
but my UPS store and the restaurants had people working there. Now they don't. Do you think that's just is that something that could be explained by
Yeah.
economic forces? Is that people got laid off, everything shut down, and then they kind of said to themselves, that was a horrible job. I'm not going back to, like, they got a break for some serenity and then realized they don't want to go back? Or did something else change economically, like in the foundation?
It's a combination of things. I'd like you for a moment to think of this COVID wave as kind of a massive experiment,
Uh-huh.
right? Not in a conspiracy sense of the term, but experiment when it comes to how we interact with workers on the lower end of the pay grade. Think of labor unions. What labor unions do is, organize labor to negotiate for better pay and working conditions and health benefits and so on. And unions, one of the things they can do is actually strike. And when they strike, to support their members, they give them a stipend, right,
Hmm.
during the strike months so that you can actually live through. It's not your full salary or anything, but to help you out during those days or weeks or month when you're striking and not getting paid by your boss. Well, think of this COVID shutdown when we send
Hmm.
millions of people home as the equivalent of that. We've sent
Yeah.
people a small stipend to survive, and we told them don't go to work because it's not safe and we're shutting down the economy. And
Nice.
that gave people a little taste of being a member of a labor union. where you can actually negotiate with your boss for better working
Huh.
conditions and better
Huh.
pay. So you
That's
can think
great.
of it
Yeah.
partially as that effect. Plus, you're watching what's happening during the pandemic, and all of your employers are reporting record profits.
Yeah.
And they're calling you back to work pretty much with the same miserable conditions plus the COVID risks on your health, on your family. And now they're saying, well, we'll give you a little bonus, $300 to sign up. Well, that doesn't cut it, right? So
Yeah.
there's all of these things that are happening, and labor organizing that's gained a few inches here and there. The Starbucks case, the Amazon case, the Walmart case. It's bringing long overdue kind of power struggle between workers, shareholders, corporations, and the government is supposed to be the referee in this process. Whereas the referee is not doing
Mm.
anything.
Mm-hmm.
Is not
Mm-hmm.
willing to step in and say, well, listen, this is a time to, readjust a few things and make sure that, everybody gets a fair share and everybody is contributing and is part of a cohesive social system. I think we've pushed the limits beyond what's reasonable, beyond what's acceptable, what's humane, and it's no surprise that you see a pushback.
So, Fadhel, the Fed was saying for a long while, we think that this current inflation is caused by some very specific conditions in the economy driven by COVID. We don't think it's going to require any action on our part. We're going to be fine. Yes, there's inflation, but we know where it's coming from. It's coming from the supply side. No problem. Then they shifted. Then everybody got freaked out. And then they started saying, no, maybe not. And then they stopped saying something. And then they started saying, maybe we'll raise interest rates. And now they're saying, 3 times they made a promise to try to quell concerns. Is that because they saw something different, or is it because the old narrative sifted back in, or what caused that? Because I was saying to all my friends who are like, Biden and the Democrats are going to run inflation so high. And I'm like, no, it's all conditional. It's all conditional. Even the Fed believes that. And then it shifted. So is that, did they see something? Do you have a sense of what caused their change that you see as an economist that people like me wouldn't notice?
Very good question. So, in the lead up to the COVID crisis, between 2008, the 2008 crisis, and the COVID crisis, all central banks around the world, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and beyond, they all had an inflation target of 2%. We were trying to avoid the cycle of deflation, which is a very dangerous cycle. Great depressions usually have deflation associated with them. So we always want to have moderate level of inflation. 2%, 3% is reasonable. Our inflation was close to zero for a long time after 2008. So we were trying to push above inflation. All central banks did everything they could to actually create a little bit of inflation, to raise inflation above that 2%. They all failed miserably, including the Fed, the ECB, Bank of England. And at some point around 2017, 2018, they all admitted, not my language, not my words, we have no reliable theory of inflation. Translation, plain English, we don't actually know what causes inflation because we tried to push those buttons.
We
And it
don't know
didn't
what we're
work.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then the COVID inflation started, and you heard the phrase transitory. This is just COVID.
Yeah.
This is just COVID. Transitory, which means as we transition out of this, we'll go back to normal, right? And that's why I was not part of team transitory, because to me it means we'll just go back to normal. And I'm like, you don't even understand what the normal inflation is caused by
Yeah. That's right.
to go back to normal. But because they thought it's all COVID related and it's all that's what the Fed's position was. We can handle 3% inflation, 4% inflation. This is going to end soon as we end COVID. But then they realized, well, COVID is still around. The inflation pressure points are getting worse. And you're the Fed. You're limited to one major policy tool. It's like you have a hammer. So all the problems you look at look
Nice.
like a nail. So what do? You hit it on the head with that hammer. That hammer is their interest rates. And what do you do when there's high inflation? You raise interest rates, which does what? It raises the cost of doing business. It creates unemployment. It takes income away from people, the most vulnerable people. It reduces demand for stuff, and that reduces the inflation pressure point. It does work in a very vicious way,
Oh,
right?
it's
Roundabout
cruel.
way.
It's
It is
Yeah.
cruel.
yeah.
Exactly.
The
But that's
way
the
to
only
drive
hammer
down
you
price.
have.
Yeah, the
The
way to
rest of
drive
the
down
toolbox.
prices is I'm sorry, Fadl, I'm
Yeah,
getting worked
I
up
know where
just
you're
listening
going,
to
Rob.
you. Yeah,
But
but the
that's the
way
hammer.
to drive down prices is to make it so that people don't have enough money to buy stuff, make their lives more miserable, and
That's
that will
exactly what we did in the
eventually pull
70s.
down.
Hmm.
That's exactly what we did in the 70s. Threw people under the bus so they don't have any money to buy anything, so we can afford gasoline, so they don't have to drive as much, right? So what we're saying is that the Fed only has that hammer, and it's just very
I
painful
see.
tool. What we have is the rest of the toolbox is in the hands of Congress, right? And Congress decided not to use any of those tools because of everything we've described here.
Yeah.
So, so I wasn't surprised to hear
Yeah.
the Fed, because Congress, President Biden, everybody else, Joe Manchin, looked at them and said, "Hey, you deal with inflation." I said, "Sure, we'll hit it on the head."
Yeah. Well, Fadhel, thank you so much. This has been so helpful. You know, these are all the conversations that frame up our current circumstance and situation in our political narratives right now. And it's just really hard for people to make sense out of any of it, because people talk in code and they don't tell you they're talking in code. Right? I mean, it's fine if someone says, "Hey, we're using, insider language to a system," but so often they don't tell you that, and then they use words that you think mean something and they actually mean something else, and off we go. So your straightforward explanation of all this is just so extremely helpful, and we want to keep talking with you about it.
Thank you. My pleasure. Anytime.
All right. Hey, to all the people watching, Mike and David and John and Jim and Brenda and Silvio, thanks for your participation here on the chat. If you haven't gone over to our Facebook channels yet, head on over there. And if you haven't been to our YouTube channel, go subscribe. We're trying to do some magic over there. So make that happen. And if you're only watching this and you don't know we have a podcast, we do. So you can subscribe to this as an audio feed and share it to friends and family that way too. Dr. Kaboub, thank you. Rob, anything else?
No, I pretty much just want Fadl to run everything. Is that possible? I mean, how do we make that happen? Is there a draft Fadl campaign that we need to kick off?
No, not anytime soon. Probably not. I'm good where I am. But we have 535 people who have all the tools on the table in front of them. They're just not using them and claiming that that they're powerless. And that's just not true.
And I do want to ask you later, because I've now realized that we'll do this in another conversation, but I first heard about what is referred to in our language here as MMT, modern monetary theory. I first heard that actually explained by Republicans, saying taxes are not how we pay for our government. Taxes is how we motivate or demotivate people to do particular things. So that's why we're opposed to taxes. And I didn't know that it fit in a larger area, in a larger theory. So I think that there's actually there's probably as much opportunity to move some Republican politicians as there is to move Democrat, because I still think Democrats are convinced we don't have enough money because rich people have too much money. That's why we can't spend. Take it from the rich and give it to the poor until there are no rich no more. That line is there. But Republicans might actually be a place to be movable. I don't know if you've had any success there, but I think, and maybe those folks are all gone. This was 15 or 20 years ago. I heard him talking about this. So maybe those people have all been sent away to, the outer depths of outside the Republican Party. But that used to be a thing that Republicans talked about. They seem to understand how the federal spending works, and were opposed to taxes for totally different reasons than most people think they are. It wasn't so you could keep your own money alone. It was because they didn't want you being controlled by the government.
Well, the Republican Party of 2020 is very different than the Republican Party of Reagan or I mean, we're talking post-Trump QAnon universe here.
It's something else.
It would be interesting to have a conversation. Maybe the next time we do this, we could talk about the politics of how do we move beyond theory into implementation. What would it take to make some real progress in this realm, in terms of connecting with politicians and people and voters, and how to do that.
Right. Absolutely.
So much more to come. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, all.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday.